In the waning days of the American Civil War, the destiny of a fractured nation teetered on the edge of chaos. The Virginia countryside, already scarred by years of conflict, braced for another brutal confrontation, this time at a remote crossroads known as Five Forks. Here the Union's relentless General Philip Sheridan, a man driven by unyielding determination, squared off against the beleaguered Confederate General George Pickett, who bore the crushing weight of a crumbling cause. As the sun dipped below the horizon on April 1st, 1865, the battlefield transformed into a maelstrom of fire and fury. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, and the cries of men locked in a desperate struggle. Amid the chaos, acts of valor and moments of despair unfolded in equal measure, each soldier a pawn in a deadly game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of a nation. The Union forces, emboldened by their superior numbers and Sheridan's fiery resolve, launched a relentless assault. Meanwhile, Pickett, distracted by a shad bake far from the front lines, found himself caught off guard as his defenses crumbled. The Confederates, outflanked and outmaneuvered, fought with a desperation born of knowing that defeat here could spell the end of their fight for independence. This was more than a battle. It was a crucible where the fates of leaders and soldiers alike were forged. Sheridan's bold leadership and Warren's tactical brilliance clashed with Pickett's faltering command, each decision rippling through the ranks and altering the course of history. Lives were lost, heroes were made, and the Confederacy's last hope began to unravel. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of cannon fire faded, the Union's victory at Five Forks marked not just a military triumph, but a turning point in the war. The fall of Petersburg and Richmond loomed, and with it, the inevitable surrender of General Robert E. Lee. This was the beginning of the end, a moment where courage, strategy, and fate collided, forever shaping the legacy of a nation. Fate is a powerful force, and each decision has the potential to change the trajectory of history indefinitely. Welcome to Five Forks, a site where heroes emerge and destinies are shaped. Before we delve into the details, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. On the morning of March 30th, 1865, a relentless rain soaked the gray-clad soldiers of Major General George Pickett's reinforced division. Following the infantry was Colonel William Pegram, accompanied by 6 artillery pieces drawn by exhausted, muddy horses. The weary Confederate troops endeavored to disregard the dismal weather as they marched westward along White Oak Road, distancing themselves from the main contingent of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, which was engaged in the defense of Petersburg, Virginia. Their destination was the vital intersection known as Five Forks, located just a few miles ahead. However, the mud and torrential rain were not their only obstacles. Federal cavalry closely trailed the Confederate column. Rather than advancing, Pickett opted to halt, organize his men into a battle line, and prepare for an impending attack, as recorded by Captain W. Jordan McCabe, Pegram's aide. This choice resulted in a significant loss of time. By late afternoon, Pickett's forces finally arrived at Five Forks, where they were met by Major General Fitz Lee and his 2 brigades of Virginia cavalry, who had valiantly attempted to fend off the enemy cavalry throughout the day. General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army, had directed Pickett and Fitz Lee to initiate a preemptive strike against a substantial federal cavalry force assembling 6 miles southeast of Dinwiddie Courthouse along the Boydington Plank Road. It was imperative for the survival of Lee's army that Major General Phil Sheridan's cavalry at the courthouse be repelled, as they posed a serious threat to the Southside Railroad, the last remaining rail line under Confederate control leading into Petersburg. The successful disruption of this railroad by the Federals would likely result in the fall of both Richmond and Petersburg. As night approached, Pickett made the decision to stay at Five Forks for the evening. He instructed his men to build defensive breastworks, which they accomplished to the best of their abilities, before settling in for the night amidst the ongoing rain. The weight of Lee's army's fate rested heavily on Pickett's shoulders. By late March 1865, General Lee faced a dire situation. His army had been under a continuous siege at Petersburg for nearly 10 months, striving to protect Richmond, the Confederate capital. The fortifications extended over 30 miles from Richmond southward to Petersburg, continuing an additional 6 miles southwest to Hatcher's Run. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, the Union Army's general-in-chief, had significantly diminished Lee's forces. In February 1865, Lee's army comprised approximately 55,000 troops, but by late March that number had dwindled due to desertions and casualties from ongoing conflicts. Opposing Lee's forces were 128,000 federal troops from two separate armies. Major General George Meade led the larger Army of the Potomac, while Major General Edward Ord commanded the smaller Army of the James. Furthermore, Major General Phil Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah had arrived in Tidewater from the Shenandoah Valley to reinforce Grant's troops. In late March, Grant formulated a strategy for Major General Gouverneur Warren's V Corps and Major General Andrew Humphrey's II Corps to maneuver around the Confederate right at Hatcher's Run. Once they flanked that position, they were directed to turn northward. Grant's objective was to lure Lee's forces out of their entrenched positions by compelling them to defend the Southside Railroad. This tactic would force Lee to withdraw some troops from his line, thereby weakening it enough for other Union forces to penetrate. Sheridan was instrumental in this strategy, which aimed to sever access to the Southside Railroad. If the Confederates were to leave their trenches and engage in open combat, Sheridan had been instructed to hold them in place while Grant's other units advanced to support an assault at Five Forks. Conversely, if the Confederates opted to stay entrenched in Petersburg, Sheridan's troops were directed to sabotage the tracks of both the South Side Railroad and the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which converged in Burkesville, Virginia, with the latter leading further into the southern regions. In the early hours of March 29th, Major General Roman Eyre's division from Warren's 5th Corps commenced its movement to flank the Confederate positions. Following Eyre were Major General Charles Griffin's 1st Division and Major General Samuel Crawford's 3rd Division, with Eyre's forces reaching Rewanee Creek by late afternoon. The Union's 2nd Corps advanced after constructing a pontoon bridge over the creek, continuing their march toward their objectives. At noon, Warren ordered Griffin's division to pivot north onto Quaker Road, a pivotal maneuver in their strategy. Meanwhile, Sheridan's cavalry corps set out from their camp before dawn on March 29th, driven by determination and purpose. Major General George Crook's 2nd Division moved along Jerusalem Plank Road, closely followed by Brigadier Generals Thomas Devon's 1st Division and George Custer's 3rd Division. Sheridan maintained command over his cavalry corps, which was under Major General Wesley Merritt during this crucial period. They arrived at Dunwoody Courthouse that evening after a long day of marching. Confederate scouts informed Lee that the Federal cavalry was indeed mobilizing. In response, Lieutenant General James Longstreet suggested forming a task force to address the threat to the Southside Railroad. He recommended that General Lee include Pickett's division from Longstreet's corps stationed in Richmond, along with a substantial cavalry contingent and several artillery batteries. Lee consented and instructed Pickett to get ready for the mission. He also directed his nephew, Fitz Lee, to bring his cavalry division to Petersburg, which arrived on March 29th, providing Fitz Lee with a total of 7 cavalry brigades. By this time, Lee had become aware that Federal infantry had crossed Rewanee Creek and that Sheridan's primary objective was Dunwoody Courthouse. Lee accurately predicted that the Federal cavalry would attempt to navigate through Five Forks en route to the Southside Railroad. Upon Fitz Lee's arrival in Petersburg, he was ordered to advance to Sutherland Station to unite with Pickett and 2 additional cavalry divisions, one commanded by Major General William Rooney Lee and the other by Major General Thomas Rosser. Fitz Lee was appointed to lead the cavalry corps. With Fitz Lee at the helm, Colonel Thomas Munford assumed command of his cavalry division. Pickett's 3 brigades converged on Petersburg, led by Brigadier Generals Montgomery Corse and George Stewart, along with Colonel Robert Mayo, who was in charge of Brigadier General William Terry's brigade. On March 29th, Pickett's division boarded trains in Richmond, heading towards Sutherland Station. Fitz Lee soon modified his orders to Sheridan on the eve of Littlefield's advance, advising him to maneuver around the enemy if feasible. The following morning, March 30th, amidst persistent rain, Sheridan set out to execute Grant's orders. He instructed Merritt to take Devon's 1st Division and scout north towards Five Forks. However, shortly after Devon's cavalry began their mission, Grant sent another message instructing Sheridan to suspend the operation due to heavy rainfall and poor road conditions. Considering this a significant mistake, Sheridan rode to Grant's headquarters and persuaded him to continue with the operation. On March 31st, Pickett readied his forces for an assault against Sheridan. The forefront of Pickett's contingent included cavalry units from Rooney Lee's and Rosser's divisions, while Pickett's infantry constituted the main force. They directed their efforts westward to target Sheridan's left flank. By mid-morning, the rain had ceased. At that moment, Brigadier General Rufus Berenger's forces from Rooney Lee's division engaged with the 2nd New York Mounted Rifles, part of Brigadier General Charles Smith's cavalry brigade. During this encounter, the Confederate troops managed to drive the Union cavalry back across Fitzgerald Ford, the southernmost crossing of Chamberlain's Creek and the nearest ford to Dinwiddie Courthouse. On the eastern side of the crossing, the New Yorkers received assistance from the 6th Ohio Cavalry, who opened fire on the Confederate cavalrymen across the stream. As the Confederate horsemen retreated, Smith dispatched a unit from the 1st Maine Cavalry to pursue them. After navigating through the rain-swollen ford, they confronted Berenger's Tar Heel cavalry and were compelled to withdraw. Under heavy fire, dismounted soldiers from the 4th North Carolina Cavalry charged through in pursuit of the Union forces. This bold maneuver quickly placed them in urgent need of reinforcements. A squadron from Brigadier General Richard Beale's brigade was the next to cross the ford, followed closely by the 2nd North Carolina Cavalry. A short distance to the north, the 1st North Carolina Cavalry also crossed the stream. Troopers from both the 1st Maine and 6th Ohio Cavalry fired their carbines at the Virginia soldiers, forcing them to retreat back to Berenger's lines for safety. By mid-afternoon, Berenger initiated another offensive. The 2nd North Carolina Cavalry encountered significant resistance from entrenched Federal cavalrymen who had fortified their positions by that time. The 1st North Carolina Cavalry crossed north of the ford, only to be met with fierce gunfire. At this juncture, Rooney Lee resolved to deploy all 4 regiments from Brigadier General Richard Beale's brigade in an attempt to overwhelm the Union forces. The combined might of Berenger's and Beale's Confederate brigades proved sufficient to drive the Federals into retreat. At Danza's Ford, the northernmost crossing of Chamberlain's Creek, Pickett's infantry and Rosser's cavalry made an attempt to cross. A detachment from Major General Henry Davies' 1st Brigade of Crook's 2nd Division was stationed to guard this ford. Although most of Davies' troops had moved south to support Smith, they were returning upon hearing the sounds of combat at Danza's Ford. Davie urged his remaining soldiers to advance for support, just as Corse's brigade, leading Pickett's lengthy column, approached the crossing. The Virginians forded the creek and quickly overpowered Davies' detachment, coinciding with Davies' arrival at the site. He dispatched Colonel Matthew Avery's 10th New York Cavalry to impede the progress of Pickett's advancing infantry. Avery instructed his men to dismount, but Corse's troops responded with precise volleys, compelling them to remount in haste. As Davies' 2 cavalry brigades neared Five Forks by mid-afternoon, they heard the sounds of battle emanating from the southwest. Accompanied by a regiment of Michigan cavalry, Davie moved toward the gunfire, only to encounter his own men retreating in disarray. Unable to effectively rally them, Davie sent a message requesting Colonel Charles Fitzhugh to advance his 2nd Brigade for support against Pickett's advancing forces. At that moment, Munford joined the advance southward along Dinwiddie Courthouse Road, while Corse continued his offensive. Realizing he was facing a significant enemy infantry force, Davie ordered both Fitzhugh's 2nd Brigade and Colonel Peter Stagg's 1st Brigade to retreat to avoid being overwhelmed. By nightfall on March 31st, the brigades of Davie, Stagg, and Fitzhugh had all reached the safety of Dinwiddie Courthouse. As the situation for the Union deteriorated rapidly, Sheridan commanded Brigadier General John Gregg's 2nd Brigade of Crook's Division and Gibbs's 3rd Brigade of Devon's Division to launch a counterattack against the advancing Confederates